On the morning of March 14, 1912, a man named Samuel Harwell walked into the U.S. Geological Survey office in Flagstaff, Arizona, alone. He had been gone for 6 weeks. 4 men had left with him. The clerk who received him that morning, a young woman named Dorothy Keene, recorded the encounter in her personal diary, one of the few first-hand accounts that survive. She wrote that Harwell appeared gaunt but composed, that his clothing was torn and stained with what might have been rust or dried mud, and that when she asked where the others were, he looked at her directly and said, "They didn't make it back." She asked how. He said nothing. She asked again. He turned and walked out of the office. This silence, immediate, total and permanent, would define the rest of Samuel Harwell's life. It was not the silence of shock or trauma that gradually softens with time. It was deliberate, practiced, unyielding. The expedition had been commissioned by the survey to map previously uncharted portions of the Grand Canyon's interior, specifically a network of secondary gorges northwest of the main corridor. The 4 men who accompanied Harwell were experienced: Theodore Marsh, a geologist from Philadelphia, James Cotter and Vincent Cotter, brothers who had worked as guides throughout Colorado and Utah, and a photographer named Isaac Drummond, hired to document geological formations for the survey's records. All 4 were considered more qualified than Harwell for wilderness work. Harwell himself was an administrative assistant, a clerk essentially, who had requested to join the expedition in writing, citing a personal interest in fieldwork. His request was approved only because the team needed someone to manage supply inventories and maintain daily logs. He was the least essential member, and he was the only one who returned. Within 48 hours of his arrival in Flagstaff, a search party was assembled. Harwell refused to join it. He also refused to provide the party with any information about where the others might be found, what route the group had taken, or what had occurred. When pressed by the expedition organizer, a man named William Taft Hollings, no relation to the president, Harwell reportedly said, "I can't help you. Not won't. Can't." The search party spent 11 days in the canyon. They found no bodies, no equipment, no camps. They returned with nothing but questions, and Harwell answered none of them. In the months that followed, pressure mounted. The families of the missing men demanded answers. The survey opened an internal investigation. The Coconino County Sheriff's Office conducted interviews. Harwell sat through each one and said nothing of substance. He confirmed only the barest facts. Yes, he had been part of the expedition. Yes, the others were dead. No, he would not explain how. There was no legal mechanism to compel him, no evidence of foul play, no witnesses to contradict him. He was formally dismissed from the Geological Survey on May 2, 1912, for failure to fulfill professional duties. He did not contest the dismissal. By summer, the story had faded from the Flagstaff papers. By autumn, the families had stopped asking. Samuel Harwell took a job as a night watchman at a lumber mill on the outskirts of town and lived alone in a rented room above a dry goods store. He remained there, in effective isolation, for the next 34 years. He never married, kept no close friends, attended no church. When spoken to, he was polite but brief. When asked about the canyon, he would walk away. In 1946, at the age of 63, Harwell died of pneumonia in a county hospital. He left behind no family, no will, and no written record. His landlord donated his few possessions to a church charity. Among them was a leather-bound field journal, standard issue from the survey, but every page had been torn out. Only the cover remained. To understand what Samuel Harwell refused to say, it is necessary first to understand what is known, what can be reconstructed from the weeks before the expedition, when all 5 men were still alive, still planning, still trusting one another. The expedition was scheduled to depart on January 29, 1912. Preparations began in early December of the previous year. Theodore Marsh, the geologist, had been advocating for the survey since 1909. He had published 2 papers on erosion patterns in the southwestern plateaus, and believed that the unmapped gorges northwest of the main canyon contained geological evidence that could refine existing theories about the Colorado River's formation. He was 41 years old, methodical and widely respected. His correspondence with the survey's director shows a man who was cautious, thorough, and keenly aware of the canyon's dangers. In a letter dated December 18, 1911, Marsh wrote, "We will carry sufficient rope, water, and provisions for 8 weeks. I have selected men I trust. This is not a race. It is documentation." James and Vincent Cotter were hired on Marsh's recommendation. Both men had worked as wilderness guides since the late 1890s, primarily in the Rocky Mountain territories. James, the elder by 3 years, had a reputation for calm under pressure. Vincent was considered the better navigator. A former client described them in a testimonial letter as unshakable. Their correspondence with Marsh shows a relationship built on mutual respect. In one letter, James Cotter reassured Marsh that the proposed route, descending through a series of ridgelines and dry washes into the deeper gorges, was ambitious but achievable, provided we don't rush. Isaac Drummond, the photographer, was 36 and had worked with the survey on 2 prior projects, both in less remote locations. He was known for his patience and his technical skill. His letters home to his wife, Claudia, reveal a man who was anxious about the expedition's length and isolation, but eager for the work. In his final letter before departure, dated January 27th, he wrote, "Marsh says this will be the most important work I've done. I believe him." And then there was Samuel Harwell. Harwell was 29. He had been with the survey for less than 2 years, working exclusively in the Flagstaff office. His duties involved filing reports, maintaining supply records, and assisting with correspondence. He had no fieldwork experience, no training in geology or navigation. His personnel file contains a single notation from his supervisor, dated November 1911. Adequate performance, quiet disposition. It was Harwell who had requested to join the expedition. In his application letter, dated December 3rd, he wrote, "I have read, Mr. Marsh's proposal with great interest and believe I could serve the team effectively in a logistical capacity. I am capable of managing inventory and maintaining records under field conditions. I would be grateful for the opportunity." Marsh approved the request. In a memo to the director, he noted, "We need someone to track supplies and keep the daily log. Harwell is disciplined and unlikely to complain. He will do." There is no record of Harwell and Marsh having any significant interaction before the expedition. No correspondence, no shared meals or meetings. Harwell was, by all accounts, a functionary. He was included because someone had to count the cans. The 5 men gathered in Flagstaff on the evening of January 28th, the night before departure. They met in the back room of a hotel near the train station to review the route and finalize the supply list. The only account of this meeting comes from the hotel proprietor, a man named George Innes, who later told investigators that the group seemed professional and well prepared. He remembered Marsh doing most of the talking. He remembered the Cotter brothers joking with each other. He did not remember Harwell saying anything at all. The next morning, they loaded 2 mules and began the descent. For the first 3 weeks, everything proceeded as planned. Marsh's field notes, recovered later by investigators from a survey archive where they had been misfiled, document steady progress. The team descended into the canyon in stages, mapping ridgelines and photographing rock faces. Drummond's images from this period, also archived, show the men working in tandem. Marsh examining strata with a hand lens, the Cotters securing ropes, Drummond framing his shots with deliberate care. Harwell appears in 2 of the photographs. In both, he is in the background, slightly out of focus, crouched beside supply crates. The daily logs, kept by Harwell as assigned, were matter-of-fact. Entries recorded mileage, weather, and inventory. There was no commentary, no personal observation. One entry, dated February 9th, reads, "Descended 400 feet. Weather clear, supplies adequate, no issues." The tone was identical in every entry. Then, on February 14th, the logs stopped. The last confirmed sighting of the full group came from a passing ranger named Albert Kohler. who encountered them on February 12th near the rim of a secondary gorge. Kohler later testified that the men were in good spirits, that they were well supplied, and that Marsh had told him they planned to descend into the gorge the following morning. Kohler asked if they needed anything. Marsh said no. Kohler shook hands with each man and continued on his patrol. He never saw any of them again, except Harwell. What happened in the month between February 12th and March 14th can only be inferred. There are no logs, no photographs, no witnesses, but there are fragments. The search party that entered the canyon in late March retraced the expedition's known route and extended their search into areas the group might plausibly have reached. They found nothing in the gorge Marsh had planned to explore. But 12 miles to the west, in a narrow drainage that would have required significant deviation from the planned route, they found a camp. It was not intact. The site consisted of a canvas tarp stretched between two boulders, partially collapsed. Beneath it were 3 empty canteens, a coil of rope, a single blanket, and a small cookpot. There were no supplies, no equipment, no indication of how long the camp had been occupied or why it had been abandoned. Most critically, there were no bodies. The search party also found approximately half a mile from the camp a shallow depression in the ground that had been recently disturbed, possibly dug and refilled. They excavated it. Inside was a leather satchel containing Isaac Drummond's photographic plates. 47 plates, carefully wrapped in cloth. Not a single one was exposed. Drummond's camera was never found. The placement of the plates, buried deliberately, preserved carefully, suggested intention. Someone had taken the time to protect them, but the plates themselves revealed nothing. Drummond had not taken a single photograph after February 11th. Why? And who buried them? The search party brought the plates back to Flagstaff. They were developed by the survey and examined for any clue. The images showed only what was already known: rock walls, equipment, the men at work. The final image, taken on February 11th, showed Vincent Cotter tying a rope around a boulder. His brother stood nearby, watching. Marsh was visible in the middle distance, writing in a notebook. Harwell was not in the frame. The investigation sought to establish a timeline. If the men had left the rim on February 13th as planned, and if the camp found by the search party had been theirs, then they had traveled 12 miles off course, deliberately or otherwise, within the first week. The terrain in that area was steep, unstable, and prone to rockfall. It was possible they had been forced to detour. It was possible they had become disoriented. But the absence of bodies complicated every theory. The gorge where the camp was found had been scoured by winter runoff. If the men had fallen or been caught in a flash flood, though the weather records for February 1912 showed no significant rainfall, their remains might have been carried miles downstream, buried under debris, or swept into inaccessible crevices. But all 4, and why was Harwell spared? Investigators pressed him on this point repeatedly. In a formal interview conducted on March 22nd, the lead investigator, a survey official named Paul Edgerton, asked Harwell directly, "How did you survive when the others did not?" Harwell's response, according to the transcript, was, "I don't know." Edgerton asked, "Were you with them when they died?" Harwell said, "No." Edgerton asked, "Then where were you?" Harwell said nothing. Edgerton tried another approach. He asked, "Did you see what happened to them?" Harwell, "No." "Did they tell you what they were planning to do?" "No." "Did you become separated?" A pause, then, "Yes." "When?" Silence. "Mr. Harwell, we are trying to help the families understand." "I can't help them." Edgerton terminated the interview. In his notes he wrote, "Subject is either concealing material facts or is suffering from dissociative amnesia. Recommend psychiatric evaluation." The evaluation was never conducted. Harwell refused to consent, and there was no legal basis to compel him. One detail did emerge, though not from Harwell. A second search party, organized privately by Theodore Marsh's brother, returned to the canyon in late April. They found, carved into a rock face near the camp, a single word: "Wait." The carving was crude, done with a knife or sharp stone. The letters were large, uneven, clearly made in haste. There was no signature, no date, no context. The search party photographed it. The image was published in the Flagstaff newspaper on May 9, 1912, beneath the headline, "Mystery Deepens in Canyon Deaths." When shown the photograph, Harwell was asked if he recognized the handwriting, or if he had carved it himself. He glanced at the image, then looked away. "I don't know," he said. It was the only time in any interview that his voice was described as unsteady. The pressure on Samuel Harwell in the months following his return was immense, but it was not uniform. It came in waves, public, private, legal, personal, and each time, Harwell absorbed it in silence and waited for it to pass. The families were the first to confront him. Claudia Drummond, Isaac's widow, traveled to Flagstaff in early April. She was 28, pregnant with their second child, and desperate for answers. She found Harwell at the lumber mill where he had taken work and asked to speak with him. He agreed to meet her outside, in the mill yard. Their conversation was brief. Claudia later described it in a letter to her sister. "I asked him to tell me what happened to Isaac. I told him I needed to know. He looked at me for a long time and I thought he might say something, but then he just shook his head and said, 'I'm sorry.' I asked him what he was sorry for. He didn't answer. I asked if Isaac had suffered. He said, 'I don't know.' I told him he was lying. He said, 'I'm not.' I told him I would never forgive him. He said he understood. Then he walked back inside." Claudia Drummond never spoke to Harwell again. She returned to Philadelphia and spent the rest of her life believing he had caused her husband's death. She said as much in letters to friends and in later interviews, but she never pursued legal action. When asked why, she said, "What could I prove? He didn't deny anything. He just refused to explain." Theodore Marsh's brother, a lawyer named Edmund Marsh, took a different approach. He hired a private investigator to reconstruct the expedition's movements and to interview Harwell under less formal circumstances. The investigator, a man named Carl Brenner, spent 2 weeks in Flagstaff in June 1912. He followed Harwell, watched him, tried to befriend him. Brenner's report, filed with Edmund Marsh on June 30th, is revealing. Subject maintains a rigid routine, rises at dawn, works without breaks, returns to his room at dusk, does not drink, does not socialize. When approached, he is polite, but evasive. I attempted to engage him in conversation on 3 occasions. Each time he declined. I asked him directly if he felt responsible for the deaths. He said, "I was there." I asked if that meant he could have prevented them. He said, "I don't know." I asked if he felt guilt. He said yes. I asked what he felt guilty for. He would not answer. Brenner concluded, subject is either concealing a crime or protecting someone, but I do not believe he acted with malice. His demeanor suggests shame, not cruelty. Edmund Marsh was unsatisfied. He continued to press the survey for a formal inquest, but the survey, facing no legal obligation and no physical evidence of wrongdoing, declined. By late summer, the case was effectively closed, but the families did not forget. Vincent Cotter's widow, a woman named Margaret, wrote to Harwell 3 times in 1913. She did not accuse him. She did not threaten him. She simply asked, in plain language, to know what had happened to her husband. She asked if Vincent had died quickly. She asked if he had mentioned her. She asked if there was anything at all, that Harwell could tell her. He never responded. Margaret's letters, preserved in a family archive, show a woman moving through grief toward resignation. The 3rd letter, dated November 1913, ends, "I no longer expect an answer, but I wanted you to know that I asked." The only person who seemed to accept Harwell's silence without resentment was James Cotter's daughter, a young woman named Ruth. She was 19 when her father died. In 1918, she moved to Flagstaff to attend Teachers College and by chance encountered Harwell at a post office. She recognized him from a photograph. She approached him, introduced herself, and asked if they could speak. He agreed, but only briefly. They walked together for 1 block. Ruth later described the encounter in a letter to her mother. "I told him I didn't blame him. I told him I just wanted to understand. He stopped walking and looked at me. He said, 'Your father was a good man.' I said I knew that. I asked if my father had been in pain. He said, I hope not. I asked if he had been with my father at the end. He said, no. I asked if he had tried to help. He said, yes. I asked if there was anything he could tell me that would help me make sense of it. He thought for a long time. Then he said, I wish I could. And I believed him. Ruth did not press him further. They parted and she never approached him again. But in later years, she told friends that she had seen something in Harwell's face that day. Something that convinced her he was not withholding the truth out of malice or cowardice, but out of something else. Something heavier. He looked, she said, like a man carrying a secret that was eating him alive. The public attention faded, but Harwell's isolation deepened. He moved through Flagstaff like a ghost. People knew who he was, the man who had come back alone, but few spoke to him. Those who did found him unfailingly polite and utterly unreachable. He worked at the lumber mill for 14 years. He was reliable, punctual, and silent. His supervisor, a man named Howard Finch, later said, he did his job. Didn't complain. Didn't talk much. Seemed like he wanted to be left alone, so I left him alone. In 1926, Harwell left the mill and took a job as a night janitor at a schoolhouse. He worked there until 1943, when his health began to fail. He lived on almost nothing. His room, according to his landlord, contained a bed, a chair, a small table, and a single shelf of books, mostly histories and field guides. No personal photographs, no keepsakes. He was never seen with the field journal, the one found after his death, its pages torn out. But several people recalled seeing him writing in the evenings by lamplight, though what he wrote remains unknown. If those writings existed, they were destroyed before his death, or taken by someone who never came forward. In his final years, Harwell's health deteriorated. He developed a chronic cough, likely from years of exposure to mill dust and cold canyon air. He was hospitalized briefly in 1945, released and returned to work. In January 1946, the cough worsened. He was admitted to the county hospital and diagnosed with pneumonia. He died on February 8, 1946, 34 years and 6 days after the expedition had entered the canyon. He was alone. The hospital chaplain, a man named Reverend Thomas Alcott, visited Harwell the day before he died. Alcott later wrote in his personal journal, I sat with him for perhaps an hour. He was weak, but lucid. I asked if there was anyone I should contact. He said no. I asked if he wanted to speak about his life. He shook his head. I asked if he was at peace. He closed his eyes. I thought he had fallen asleep, but then he said very quietly, I did what I thought was right. I asked him what he meant. He didn't answer. I asked if he wanted absolution. He said, for what? I said, for whatever you carry. He opened his eyes and looked at me. He said, I'll carry it to the end. Those were the last words he spoke to me. Harwell died the following morning. His body was buried in the Flagstaff Municipal Cemetery in an unmarked grave. No service was held. No obituary was published. The only record of his death is a single line in the hospital's ledger. Samuel Harwell, age 63. No known family. In the years since Samuel Harwell's death, the question of what happened in the Grand Canyon in February 1912 has been revisited periodically by historians, by journalists, by amateur investigators. Each attempt to solve the mystery has ended in the same place, with silence. But silence, as it turns out, is not the absence of meaning. It is a choice. And Samuel Harwell's silence was deliberate. The evidence, though fragmentary, suggests a pattern. Harwell did not refuse to speak because he had forgotten, or because he was traumatized into muteness, or because he feared prosecution. He refused to speak because he had made a decision, one that he adhered to for the rest of his life. Consider what is known. He returned alone, but he did not claim innocence. When asked if he felt responsible, he said yes. When asked if he felt guilt, he said yes. He did not deflect. He did not minimize. He accepted the weight of what had happened, but he did not explain it. Consider also what he did not do. He did not flee. He remained in Flagstaff, where the families could find him, where investigators could question him, where his silence would be most conspicuous. He did not change his name or disappear. He lived openly, if quietly, as though he were waiting, perhaps hoping, to be understood without having to speak. He did not profit. He took no money, sought no attention, wrote no memoir. He lived in poverty and died in obscurity. He did not forget. The chaplain's account, "I'll carry it to the end," suggests a man who remembered everything, who bore the burden of memory deliberately, and who believed that silence was the only honorable response. Why? One possibility, advanced by several historians, is that Harwell witnessed something he believed would be too painful for the families to bear. Perhaps the men died slowly, or in fear, or in a manner that would haunt those who loved them. Perhaps Harwell decided that some truths were too cruel to share, and that silence was an act of mercy. Another possibility is that Harwell made a choice in the canyon, a choice that saved his life but cost the others theirs. Perhaps he was offered a chance to survive and took it, and the guilt of that choice made explanation impossible. Perhaps he believed that to speak would be to justify what could not be justified. A third possibility, less often considered, is that Harwell was protecting someone or something that couldn't be named without causing further harm. The carved word "wait" suggests coordination, suggests intention, suggests that someone, at some point, made a plan. If that plan failed, and if Harwell believed that explaining it would implicate someone else, living or dead, then silence might have been the only way to honor a trust. But these are only possibilities. The truth died with Harwell. What remains is the outline of a man who chose not to speak, and who lived with that choice for 34 years. In 1979, a researcher named Dr. Evelyn March, working on a broader project about early Geological Survey expeditions, obtained access to the survey's archives and found, misfiled in a box labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence 1910-1915, a single envelope addressed to Theodore Marsh's widow, dated March 1912. The envelope had never been opened. Inside was a letter, unsigned, written in a careful hand. "He did not suffer. He spoke of you at the end. I am sorry I cannot say more. I hope you will forgive me." The handwriting matched samples of Samuel Harwell's administrative notes from his time at the survey. The letter had been written, sealed, and filed, but never sent. Dr. March attempted to locate Theodore Marsh's widow, but she had died in 1954. There was no one left to receive the letter. When asked why Harwell might have written it but never delivered it, Dr. March offered this. Perhaps he realized that even this small comfort would raise more questions than it answered, and perhaps he decided that the questions were worse than the silence. The last word on Samuel Harwell comes from an unexpected source, a journal entry written by Ranger Albert Kohler, the man who had encountered the expedition on February 12, 1912. Kohler retired from the Park Service in 1938. In his later years, he kept a private journal in which he reflected on his decades in the canyon. In an entry dated October 1944, 2 years before Harwell's death, Kohler wrote, "I think often of the 5 men I met that day in 12. I shook their hands. I wished them well. I never saw 4 of them again. The 5th I saw once more years later in Flagstaff. I recognized him on the street. He recognized me too. I thought about stopping him, asking him, but I didn't. I could see in his eyes that he didn't want to be asked. Some men carry their dead with them. I think Harwell was one of those. I think he came back from that canyon, but part of him never left." The story of Samuel Harwell is not a story of what happened. It is a story of what was not said. And in the end, that is the only certainty. 4 men entered the canyon and did not return. 1 man returned and would not speak. The families grieved without answers. The investigators closed the case without resolution, and Samuel Harwell lived the rest of his life in the shadow of a silence he had chosen. He was not a villain. He was not a hero. He was a man who believed, rightly or wrongly, that some things were better left unsaid, and so he said nothing. The canyon kept its dead. Harwell kept his silence, and in the space between those two certainties, the mystery remains.